As we all know, the internet has fundamentally changed how we communicate with each other and how we transact business. There are over 2.5 billion internet users worldwide, with some 250 million in the United States, but almost 600 million in China. Every day, hundreds of millions of people all around the world shop, sell, bank, learn, communicate, and work online. And each year, the world does an estimated $10 trillion of business online. Indeed, in 10 years, global online transactions are estimated to exceed $24 trillion a year. And The Economist says that China's e-commerce market was $200 billion in the year 2012 and could hit almost $300 billion this year. And every year, Alibaba, China's e-commerce company, handles over $170 billion in sales. That's more than eBay and Amazon combined. A report from McKinsey predicts that by 2020, the size of China's online retail market will exceed that of today's US, Japanese, UK, and German, and French markets combined. And that's not just computers I'm talking about. The Chinese government this July reported that there are some 464 million smartphone users in China, more than any other single country in the world. And these Chinese social media apps are becoming so sophisticated and popular that many Americans are using them to stay connected with their friends in China and elsewhere. For example, WeChat, which our family uses, is a popular app that allows users to text or send voice messages to defined groups of friends, and some are saying that WeChat might be the first Chinese app to go global. But apps like WeChat that allow texting or voice calls through the data connections are transforming the communications economy and actually cutting into the revenues of the traditional phone carriers. The consulting and research firm Ovum estimated last year that the various telecom operators lost over $10 billion due to social messaging apps in 2011. And to give you a sense of scale, the Chinese firm iResearch recently determined that on China's most popular app, QQ Instant Messenger, users spent over 20 billion minutes during the month of January 2013. That's the equivalent of 344 million hours or 14 million days spent using one app in just 1 month. Numbers like these also speak for themselves in describing the business opportunities in China. However, there are many challenges in China for companies who work in our increasingly globalized internet economy. So I'd like to address just a few of those issues. China's Great Firewall and the challenges it poses to internet-based companies are all too familiar to many of you in this room, because China has been developing a parallel, separate internet for well over a decade. China's motivations are clear. The government has an overriding interest in regime stability and information control, domestic security, and promotion of Chinese companies. And we in America consistently make the case to the Chinese government and to the Chinese business leaders that countries who restrict access to information on the internet are actually walling themselves off from the rest of the world and from progress. For countries operating in today's global economy, an uncensored and open internet are essential to attract capital, to spark innovation, and to nurture entrepreneurship. Attempts to unleash the power, the economic power of the internet while controlling political and cultural content are ultimately counterproductive and indeed at odds with each other. Slow internet speeds, intermittent blocking of websites, unsecure transfer of information all hinder the routine operations of businesses in all sectors. And such an environment discourages investment, whether domestic or foreign, and hampers innovation. Imposing ambiguous standards on the internet for permissible content only burdens compliant internet-based companies with extra costs. To support e-commerce in a global economy, we must encourage broad acceptance of the value of an open internet, so that companies don't have to fend for themselves in determining permissible content in every different country around the world. The tangible economic benefits that I've cited are just some of the reasons why internet freedom is so important. Restrictions on communication that limit the free flow of ideas, whether political, economic, or personal, will only serve to prevent countries from moving forward. Frankly speaking, the United States and Chinese governments have different views on these issues, but we're constantly, consistently, and candidly discussing them. We argue against China's internet restrictions both because we believe that information should be free and readily accessible, but also because these restrictions unfairly impact the newest and most creative businesses in the United States, but also in China. China's leadership has made IT sector development a national priority, investing substantial funds and driving policies aimed to move from made in China to created in China. One of China's goals is developing the kind of innovative, creative economy that Silicon Valley represents. For you, the current and future generations of entrepreneurs, China's emergence offers significant opportunities. Make no mistake, you are the talent that China seeks to attract. And while there are opportunities, there are also risks. You and your creative ideas may be actively courted, but it's important to remember that China also wants to build up its own businesses and its talent base. The Chinese government is using every bureaucratic and regulatory mechanism to promote its own companies. And some of these policies raise concerns regarding the protection and the enforcement of U.S. intellectual property rights, barriers to foreign investment, and forced localization of product development and R&D. These are just some of the issues. For example, in some of the telecom areas, U.S. firms are required to partner with Chinese firms in order to get a license for their products. And this helps the Chinese partner, quite frankly, develop its own products so that it can compete on an international level. The Chinese government has forced new regulations that require data centers to be located in China, which directly impacts the ability of U.S. companies to enter the market. And foreign IT companies are also reporting difficulties selling their products to the Chinese government agencies and state-owned enterprises. But there's also no question that foreign businesses can be successful in China. And one model of success is to find a Chinese partner and build your business from the ground up, jointly pursuing R&D and with a joint stake in any subsequent IP. If China has a stake in your business, then it's more likely to support your business. And this is the model that IBM Research has adopted with the establishment of some 12 research centers in China. But this approach poses challenges as well. Companies must make sure both they and their Chinese partners will protect and enforce their intellectual property, including their trade secrets. And U.S. companies that work with the Chinese government on corporate social responsibility projects are also better perceived in China than those who only seek to sell their products. For example, several companies built substantial goodwill in China after the 2008 Sichuan earthquake that killed some 70,000 people, left 5 million homeless. And these companies helped set up wireless facilities and connected hospitals through DVC links so that doctors could consult on surgeries. Another successful model is building an enterprise that relies on an ecosystem of talent and creativity. If your company isn't centered on just one single piece of technology that can be readily transplanted elsewhere by an employee with ill intent, that is, again, if your company isn't just founded on one product that someone could actually rip off, then your business may thrive in a Chinese partnership. And for those who decide to bring IP to China, we cannot overemphasize the importance of finding strong legal counsel who is intimately familiar with Chinese law. Find advisors who know how to obtain the proper protection for your intellectual property, and do so as soon as possible. You also need to think about the related areas of Chinese law, such as how to write an appropriate non-disclosure agreement. Expecting the Chinese system to work on American terms is a recipe for failure. And then let me say that some think that the best way to avoid being ripped off in China is to stay out of China. But besides missing a tremendous opportunity, companies that never set foot in China are not immune from having their IP infringed upon in China, and may later find infringing products making their way back to the United States or to third world markets. The good news is that Chinese leaders increasingly recognize that a strong IPR system is an important step in building the kind of creative economy that they want. And they're working to strengthen their IPR protection and enforcement mechanisms, although much, much more needs to be done. And the United States government is dedicating significant resources to facilitate this transformation. We actually have a lot of cooperation between U.S. and Chinese law enforcement and actual intellectual property protection agencies. We also have a very robust interagency team that engages China on IPR policies and issues, from commenting on proposed Chinese legislation to actually advocating specific changes to IPR protection and enforcement practices. We continue to advocate for an open internet and a level playing field, and we do so in both public and in private forums. But we're also realistic in our expectations from all of these activities. We know that regime stability will remain an overriding factor for the Chinese Communist Party in crafting all policies, including their information technology policies. And economic growth will remain a key aspect of underpinning the party's legitimacy. So we call on you, the entrepreneurs that China seeks to attract, to partner with us in emphasizing the importance of the rule of law, IPR protection, transparent policies in building a creative and modern economy. Joining together to engender a more open set of IT policies in China will benefit innovators and entrepreneurs in both China and the United States, and ultimately will benefit the consumers in China and all around the world. With that, I thank you and look forward to a discussion with Orville and with all of you. Thank you very much.
You know, listening to you talk, it occurs to me that there's a bit of a riddle and I'm wondering how you would answer this sort of conundrum. On the one hand, you have out here before you a lot of incredibly creative, innovative, modern, global people from China and from the US. Now, in your job as ambassador, you deal with a different echelon, mostly in the government. And it seems to me the way these two groups operate is distinctly different. So how does one analyze these sort of very, very different echelons of society that are working their way out through China's progress towards the future?
Well, I think the Chinese leaders very much want to move away from simply an economic model based primarily on infrastructure investment and exports of manufactured goods that have been manufactured at low wages. They want to move to more domestic consumption, and they want to move to a high-wage innovation society. And that's where I think all the entrepreneurs and the innovators in the room come in, because you all know that you don't want to spend a lot of money and blood, sweat, and tears developing a product or a technology only to have it ripped off by someone else, whether in China or any other country. And so I think the Chinese leaders also recognize for China to move into that high innovation society, high wage innovative society, that they also need to step up the enforcement of intellectual property rights. We're seeing progress in this area. And just as much as foreign companies complain about IPR protection, we're actually hearing more and more from the Chinese entrepreneurs themselves demanding improvement in IPR law and enforcement. So I think really that's going to be the driving force that will really help change the policies of China.
So if you look at the 2 years plus that you've been in China, what would you describe as sort of the major trend lines that are those that are hopeful and perhaps some that are not?
Well, we're seeing a lot more opening up of sectors to foreign businesses and transactions. We think that more needs to be opened up, especially in the financial services area. Because if China really wants to move to more domestic consumption and not be so reliant on exports, I mean, China will always have a large part of their economy dependent on exports, but if they want to rebalance it, to move to more innovation and manufacturing within China geared for consumption by the Chinese people, then they need to open up a lot of these sectors like financial services so that people can, instead of having to save all of their money and putting it under a mattress for retirement, medical emergencies, and so forth, they have more savings options through financial reform, credit cards, pension planning, investment, insurance, et cetera, et cetera. They won't need to keep so much cash tucked away and can instead use it for what we call domestic spending. So these reforms, I think, are very much in China's own economic interest and in trying to achieve the policies that the government leaders have said they need to embark on and that they recognize are necessary themselves. So we're seeing some of that, but still a lot of people feel that the last 5-10 years reform and opening up has stalled. And so people are very much looking forward to the announcements of the new economic policies to be announced by the new leadership this coming November during the third plenum of the Communist Party. Everybody's waiting. People in China are waiting. Entrepreneurs around the world are waiting to see in what areas the leadership will focus on, at what pace they'll move, and in what direction.
And do you think they will be able to rise to the occasion of whatever inflection point they seem clearly to be at, where we requires a kind of a new act of some sort of bold new step forward in the reform world?
Well, there are obviously a lot of groups within China that benefit and like the current system and like the status quo. And again, it really depends on the areas of reform, the pace of reform, direction of reform, the degree of reform. So we'll just have to wait and see.
You know, I noted with interest today that Freedom House just released their annual sort of Internet Freedom Index, and on a scale of 1 to 100, I think there were 60 countries, and China scored an 86, which was lower this year than the previous year, which looks like a trend line that's going towards more rather than less control.
Well, obviously we've heard a lot of news recently about government cracking down or sending a stern message to people using the internet for social commentary, and many influential business bloggers, the so-called V-bloggers, are now talking, perhaps at the urging of the Chinese government, about making sure there's no rumor spreading or, being more careful of what they say. So there's definitely a chill going through the ranks of those who are very active on the internet.
Mm-hmm. If you look at U.S.-China relations and the many months you've spent trying to keep that garden well weeded, would you say we're making progress in retrograde motion, or that we're on a kind of a status quo?
Well, I think you have to look at it over the totality of years of relationship and not just look at an isolated point, because the relationship will go up and down, and whether on economic policies, political policies, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the relationship going back to when President Nixon had made his first historic trip to China to where we are now, our two countries are so intertwined economically. I mean, back when Nixon was president, when he made that first visit, our yearly trade each year was less than 100 million for the whole year. And now our two countries transact $1.5 billion per day. Very few jobs depended on trade between China, whether in China or the United States. Now over 700,000 American jobs directly depend on making or exporting made-in-USA goods and services to China, and millions more Chinese jobs depend on making things that we buy at whether at Macy's or Home Depot or Costco or any of our local stores. So our economies very much are intertwined. And we also have a lot of U.S. companies that are making things in China for the Chinese people and supporting many more jobs in China and doing great corporate social responsibility, engaging in great corporate social responsibility as well. But the relationship goes up and down. It goes up and down. Just as we have disputes from time to time with either the UK or France or Germany or Mexico or Canada. So I think you have to look at it over the long haul. But a lot of people talk in Asia and especially China about the U.S. rebalance or pivot to Asia. The rebalance is really a desire by the United States to focus more time and energy on the entire Asia-Pacific region. And it's not to contain China, but really to engage with all the countries of the Asia-Pacific, which make up almost 3/4 of the world's GDP. I think 3 out of the 4 largest economies are in the Asia-Pacific region. And so vital ecosystems, virtually every international issue that the United States is concerned about involves the Asia-Pacific region. So it's only natural that President Obama, from the day he took office, wanted to have greater engagement with China and the other Asia-Pacific countries. And that's what really the pivot is about, more engagement strategically, militarily, economically, culturally with the Asia-Pacific region, and including China, and especially with China. That's why we've had so many cabinet secretaries visit China, several of them visiting several times over the last several years, including defense secretaries, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, the National Security Advisor, Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State, Energy Secretary, Agricultural Secretary, and the list goes on and on. And many more high-ranking Chinese officials, including members of the military, visiting the United States.
And yet, despite this sort of incredible interaction that we now engendered between the two countries and all of these exchanges, there is something that is rather distinctive to the U.S.-China relationship, which seems perennially to keep us from sort of forging the sort of new partnership, which I think everybody sort of would like, and which actually makes everybody, in my view, very nostalgic for the Nixon-Kissinger time, which was the last moment that we leapfrogged forward. What do you think it is that just sort of sticks between us and prevents us from moving to some new level?
Well, I think, there's a lot of nostalgia over Nixon-Kissinger days, but life was so much simpler then, on both sides. The world has become very, very complex, and everybody's worried about the economy, both in China and the United States. There's a lot of competition among our companies. Competition is good, but sometimes the competition engenders suspicions and hostilities. So we need to make sure that we have good, friendly competition and that we have a level playing field. I think that's what a lot of Americans are concerned about, is the lack of a level playing field. Where you have so many sectors closed off to American companies, and yet in the United States, virtually everything is open to Chinese investment. There's not a strong rule of law yet in China. It's developing. And so if American companies or any foreign company feel wronged and want redress, it's very difficult to get that redress. Whereas in the United States, any person can sue the President of the United States of America, can sue me when I was governor and even win. And even some of my own friends, lawyers and supporters, were suing me, and then we play baseball together afterwards or something like that.
It's the American way.
It's the American way,
Before we throw it open to you all, I wonder, as you sort of look forward, are you fundamentally optimistic about the relationship between the U.S. and China? After all, if we don't get along, there are an awful lot of problems that will not be solved in the world.
I am optimistic because I've really seen so many, a much higher level of interaction between our companies, our scientists, our researchers, our political people, and everyday people. I truly believe that so many of the problems facing America, or facing the world, cannot be solved by the United States alone, nor can they be solved by China alone. Take climate change. I mean, if the United States makes a breakthrough, and I heard the earlier panel just before lunch talk about the incredible energy revolution occurring in the United States, where because of shale gas. I mean, gas is 1/5 the cost. The cost of gas, natural gas in the United States, is 1/5 the cost of that now in Asia. Natural gas prices are 20% of what they are in Asia. And the cost of electricity is actually 1/2 of what it is in the rest of the developed countries. Right? So we can go on an energy revolution. I mean, we still produce more greenhouse gases per capita than any other country. But we're starting to shift toward cleaner fuels. But the point is that whatever we do, if China isn't also involved, it will not impact and make a substantial dent in global warming. At the same time, if China makes a breakthrough and we don't follow suit, it will be for naught. And so whether it's finding a cure to some of the most dreaded diseases of the world, or ending the proliferation of nuclear weapons, whether in North Korea or Iran and elsewhere, China and the United States have to be involved together. And indeed, the world is looking for leadership from both the United States and China to solve some of these toughest challenges and problems facing the universe. So I'm optimistic. I am optimistic. And you look out onto this audience here, you see all the incredible entrepreneurs within China, and those who are studying here in our colleges and universities. I mean, America has the best colleges and university system in the world because Stanford and other schools are focusing on critical thinking, not memorization, but critical thinking to enable the students of today to solve the problems that will emerge tomorrow. So that's why I'm optimistic. But one thing that I do hope more of is that we need more Americans visiting China to really understand the history, the culture, the complexity, and the language of China. As I said in my remarks, you can't approach American issues, or you can't approach China from the American viewpoint. And that's why we need to have more students studying in China. We have now some 200,000 Chinese students in the United States studying every single year, but only at most 20,000 American students studying in China. So if we want that collaboration, we've got to have greater parity. And that's why President Obama has launched the 100,000 Strong Initiative, which seeks to have 100,000 American students studying in China over the next several years. And the Chinese government has even offered funding for scholarships for those American students. So, American students really need to take advantage of that. And again, if you're able to say that you speak Chinese, have studied in China, that puts you a leg up in your job search after graduating from business school or any other institution or any other major or specialty. So it's in students' economic self-interest, quite frankly, and career development to spend some time in China.
I can't resist asking you just as a final question, how do you think things like the closing of our government in Washington affects sort of the Chinese view of the United States as a model worth emulating?
Well, I think that China is probably scratching its head, and of course, a lot of the Chinese leaders.
A lot of us are doing that.
Well, Americans too, We're all scratching our heads. First of all, I think there's also a lack of understanding by the Chinese about the American political system. I mean, oftentimes in meeting with the Chinese leaders, they're complaining about the acts of Congress and the resolutions and the legislation passed by Congress, and demanding of President Obama to, stop what the Congress is doing. They don't understand that Congress truly is an independent, separate, equal branch of government. Many Americans don't understand that either, so I mean that compounds things.
But it must make your job as ambassador a little more difficult.
A little bit more difficult. A little bit more difficult.
Okay, let's have some questions from you. I assume there are microphones to go around, so raise your hand.
I guess the idea is to come up to the microphones.
Come up to the microphones,
yeah,
yes,
they got,
indeed, then we can
microphones
see you.
scattered around the room.
Let's start right here.
All right.
I have a question for you. You know, I understand you're out there to look out for the interest of U.S. companies and U.S. citizens and are dealing with China. But at the same time, this sort of you know, negative views come from the U.S. government about China, and it ends up, I think, sometimes causing U.S. interest. Public company investors in the U.S., Wall Street, let's call it, has a kind of a very negative view of businesses in China, more so than venture interest and maybe private equity interest. So I wonder if you could just talk about whether, you know, how you sort of encourage public companies to partner and work well with China, while at the same time trying to protect their interests without being so negative. Thank you.
Well, we always caution American companies doing business in China simply to have as much advice as possible, consulting with lawyers, protecting themselves as much as possible, and having a thorough legal document instead of a skinny document to really anticipate either success and how you might want to move to the next stage, but also if there's a hiccup in the relationship, how you can terminate a partnership and how to exit China. So the thing that we are always advising American companies is to be careful, go in with your eyes open, and protect yourselves. At the same time, so many American companies that are in China are reporting great success. So they have a lot of lessons that they can also impart to other businesses. Let me just say on visas, we're very proud of what we've been able to accomplish since I've arrived as ambassador. Just before I arrived as ambassador, the Chinese people had to wait sometimes 70 to 100 days to get a visa interview. And our manager said there was nothing they could do to change it. They couldn't make it any better. And I said, well, they have to. And within 2 months, the wait time to get a visa interview has dropped to 5 days. And sometimes you can get your interview the next day if you call in or go over on the internet. We've also made it easier for you to renew your visa. You can actually do it by dropping it off at a CITIC bank. And even if your visa has expired, you have up to 4 years to renew your visa without an interview, and you can still drop it off at a CITIC bank. We would like to actually give the Chinese a longer visa than just 1 year multiple entry. We'd like to actually give the Chinese a 5-year multiple entry visa, if the Chinese government will also give Americans a 5-year multiple entry visa. So, but we're actually having good discussions with the Chinese government. They're receptive. They're receptive to making it longer, so we hope to have progress there. Now, if you are studying in a very specialized field, sometimes it takes longer. I mean, you can have your visa interview, or you can drop it off, but it might require extra clearance. So just if you're in a specialized field, a very highly technical field, it sometimes takes longer to renew your visa. Now, here's the one thing about students. You get your student visa. It's a 1-year visa, but it's 1 year to come into the United States. Once you're here, you can stay here until you graduate. You don't need to renew your visa. Unless you go back to China for, let's say, vacation. Then your visa is more than, it's expired because you know, let's say you're a junior or a senior, you go back to the United States. You only had a 1-year visa to get here, and it's been maybe 2 years since you got here, so now you need a new visa to come back. So that's what sometimes holds up the Chinese student. So plan ahead, plan ahead.
I have to say, this has been a small or large miracle, the way the consular service in China and the U.S. side has responded. So congratulations.
Thank you. Our people did a great job, job. We did it without new people, without new facilities, without extra money. We just completely revamped, re-engineered, redesigned the whole thing. When I was governor of the state of Washington, you have to wait 1 hour standing in line to renew your driver's license. And I said, that's nuts. We got it down within a year to 10 minutes. So,
okay, I think we have time for one last question. You, sir.
Ambassador, thanks for sharing this time with us today. You touched briefly on climate change. And between the United States and China, I think we generate something like almost 50% of the greenhouse gases that are produced annually in the world. Now that I guess with the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, obviously we're no longer denying the fact of climate change. Do you see any further alliance or concrete steps that China and the U.S. could together share to address greenhouse gas?
We actually have joint funded research between China and the United States on clean energy and climate change issues, so that we don't have to worry about the IP issues, because we're actually both paying for it and supporting it, developing it. And we also have a lot of collaborations and workshops between our scientists. I can tell you that a lot of the local government officials throughout China are asking us for names of engineering firms in the United States that can help them address their water issues, their air quality issues, and all the pollution that they already are facing. So there's a lot of collaboration going on. Chinese want more. We're eager. You know, that's the great thing about American products and services, is that we make such great things. We offer such incredible services that are highly valued and in great demand by the Chinese people, that can raise the quality of life for the people of China, that can also help the Chinese leaders achieve their objectives of modernizing and developing the country. These are the win-win opportunities that we want.
Well, please join me in thanking Ambassador Locke.
All right,
Thanks
great.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you.